G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Hebrews. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So thank you for coming along today. We're looking at Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 to 18. Last session, we saw that Messiah, Jesus, is supreme to all that preceded him, because in the past, revelation came in various ways. We had acts of creation. We had it through the patriarchs, the angels, the prophets, and it came in through dreams and visions and through direct revelation. Also came through things like regulations and laws, Mosaic law, for instance. But now that Messiah has come, that ends a period of God speaking to men. And the new method of revelation comes via the incarnation, and it is Jesus who revealed the Father by what he said, and he revealed the Father by what he is and what he did. Revelation now comes to that one unique Son, and the apostles wrote of his life, his ministry, the things he said, his teachings. And the New Testament apostles and the prophets were the guys who laid down the revelation brought to them by the Son, Jesus Christ. And they were the ones who laid the foundation, the apostles and Jesus Christ, with Jesus being the chief cornerstone. So those were the ones who laid the foundations for us today in the New Testament. The writer of the Hebrews shows that the Son is eligible to be the revealer of the word because he's an heir, he's in control of all things. These are the things we went through last session. He possesses deity. He has the very character of God. Jesus, the Son, is the one who upholds the universe, and he is man's redeemer, and he is sovereign over all of humanity. We saw we started to look at the superiority of the Son to angels. We covered and then the writer shows that Jesus is superior to angels, which is, remember, angels is one of those three pillars of Judaism: angels, Moses, and the Levitical system. Now, at his incarnation, he was made a little lower than the angels, but at his resurrection, and now in his exaltation, he is once again in his humanity better than the angels. Now, he's superior to the angels. Why? Because he is the Son. He is the unique Son. He's an heir, and he will also rule over Israel from the throne of David, his forefather. No angel will ever rule over Israel, sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. Angels are going to worship him, so the lesser worships the greater. Angels are his servants. We saw he also has an eternal throne and kingdom. And where is he at the moment? He's seated at the right hand of God the Father, which shows equality with God the Father, and no angel ever has that position. Angels, we see, are actually servants to those who inherit salvation, but the Lord is over all things. Okay, so today we come now to continue from chapter 2, verse 5. Chapter 2, verse 1. We didn't do this last session. And this is the first parenthetical warning on the danger of drifting. And we see this in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. Therefore, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things that were heard, lest haply we drift away from them. For if the word spoken through angels prove steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which having at the first been spoken through the Lord, was confirmed unto us by them that heard, God also bearing witness with them, both by signs and wonders, and by manifold powers, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit, according to his own will. Now, it is at this point that the author goes into this is the first of those 5 deviations we briefly touched on earlier. And he gives this first warning here, and it's about, and actually we're going to see that the warnings that are going to become, they're going to move from lesser to greater, they're going to progress and get stronger as we go along. So now we're going to go into the drifting one. The last one will be the defying one. And this warning here has now been based upon what he just showed us previously. And that is that the Messiah is superior to angels. And before he goes on to show another line of evidence here, we have this little warning. So in verse 1, he begins with the word therefore. And what's it there for? Because it's now the application of the previous truth that he just dealt with. That's verses 1 to 14. Because Jesus is superior to angels, for this reason, we ought to give very special attention, lest haply we drift away. The Greek word for drifting here is used of a boat that has been untied from its mooring and is now drifting. And it means to simply to flow beside or to flow past or to slip off or to slip into the wind. Really, it means to disappear from memory. The emphasis here is that which the recipients of this epistle have learned, they must not let it flow away or disappear from memory, or don't let it slip away. The reality is that we do not backslide suddenly. We actually backslide gradually. We drift away from the doctrines of the Lord until we're far away. That's how we backslide. Now, the point of the application here is that the revelation that comes through the Son carries far more obligations for these guys here, or for the recipients, than the revelation that was mediated through angels or men. Why? Because we saw before that the Son is superior to angels and he's superior to men. Angels are superior to men, yes, and revelation that came through angels, that actually carried obligations. Have a look at the Mosaic Law, for instance. But the Son is superior to angels. Therefore, the revelation that came through the Son carries heavier obligations and heavier judgment if it is ignored. And remember that the whole danger that these Hebrew Christians are facing is making an irrevocable decision and going back into Judaism to escape the persecution of the day. So the writer is warning them, don't drift away, because there are severe judgments if you do. And because of this fact, they must give more attention, more earnest heed. The scripture says more earnest heed to what he has revealed, what Jesus has revealed. And the expression here, the things that were heard, that's the body of doctrinal truths which these believers have now been exposed to. They must pay special attention to the new revelation given by means of the Son. And then next we see in verses 2 to 3, the author points out that it's impossible to escape. It's impossible to escape from receiving the just recompense if we neglect so great a salvation. And now recompense is, the reward, if you like. And he gives the reason why the readers should pay more attention to this new revelation. He says, for if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and this is in Greek, it's a first-class condition, which means that it means that the statement is true, that the word spoken through angels is steadfast, and that's true. If the law, remember the law came through, Moses received 10 commandments written on tablets of stone, but the other 603 were mediated by angels. So what we see here is that if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, the Mosaic law proved steadfast, and here we see again that we see here that it was the angels who mediated the other 603 commandments. Nowhere else in the Old Testament says that, but it was actually a rabbinic tradition And here we see that the New Testament here actually confirms that rabbinic tradition, that it actually was angels that brought the other 603 laws to Moses. We also see it in Acts chapter 7, verse 53, and Galatians 3:19. Now, so if God used angels in the divine work of revelation, including the Mosaic law. Now, if the word spoken by the angels proved to be steadfast, it proved to be sure, and it proved to be firm, how much more will this be true of revelation that came by means of one who is superior to the angels, the Son? And also, if you look back in, you will see that every sin under the Mosaic law, mediated by these angels, received a just punishment, which was a physical punishment. Every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward. A just recompense or a just punishment does not refer to the loss of salvation. It is a loss of temporal blessings in the form of divine discipline. Punishment of the law was never a loss of salvation. It was physical death. It was never a loss of salvation. It was simply physical death. For example, three examples. In Leviticus 10, cast your mind right back there. The two sons of Aaron, remember, Nadab and Abihu, both of them disobeyed the Mosaic law by burning the incense improperly. And what happened to them? They were smitten, physically dead, struck down. In Numbers 16, we had three rebels. We had Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. They led a revolt against Aaron and Moses, Aaron being the high priest, and God judged them by having the earth open up and swallow them and their families. Physical death. In Joshua chapter 7, we had the man called Achan, and he disobeyed the law, and he was stoned to death. Physical death. Now the law, physical punishment. Now the law was given by God to Moses through angels, but even though it came through angels, anyone who disobeyed it received a just punishment according to what the law said. So how much more will this be true if they neglect a salvation mediated through the Son, Jesus Christ? And the word used here for neglect means to have an attitude of indifference. Yes, Christ died for me. Yes, I'm saved. Yeah, okay, so what? Well, so what? That's showing an attitude of indifference to it. Here it means a complete indifference to what one has, an indifference in carrying out what faith demands. Now, these Hebrews are people who have salvation. It's in their possession, but they are neglecting it. They are becoming indifferent to it. And the Greek word means to have no care or concern for it. They've become apathetic. And God does not tolerate believers becoming apathetic to their salvation. Salvation was the greatest gift. It cost the life of Jesus Christ, and so we should not treat it as if it was nothing. The fact here for these Hebrew believers is that they're thinking about going back into Judaism and into the old Levitical system, which shows that they are becoming indifferent to the salvation that they actually possess. Therefore, the author writes to them, how can anyone escape if they neglect a salvation mediated through the Son? How can you possibly think you're going to escape some sort of judgment? And the phrase here, how shall we escape, implies that there's absolutely no possible way of escape from a just recompense of reward. If they do what they're thinking they're going to do, they're going to be disciplined. It will mean physical discipline in this life, and we're going to find that when we get down to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 to 11. That's Hebrews 12, 5 to 11. And it will certainly mean physical death in the coming judgment. Remember, this is happening just prior to AD 70, when the Romans came and destroyed the temple and Jerusalem. So what we're seeing here is that if a believer develops a complete indifference to the salvation that has been received, if he becomes indifferent in carrying out what faith demands, then he's going to be subject to divine discipline. And the point here is that salvation is in their possession. They have salvation, they're believers in Messiah, but they're neglecting it, or they're becoming indifferent to it. And they said, well, we'll just put aside our salvation for a while and we'll slip back into the Judaism, the old Levitical system, so that we don't get persecuted anymore. And by neglecting their salvation, these believers may put themselves into a position requiring divine discipline. Now, under the law, under the Mosaic law, divine discipline came upon Israel as the covenant people of God. However, because they are the children of God under grace, these Hebrew believers, divine discipline comes upon individual believers who continue in a state of disobedience. It's no longer upon the entire nation, it's upon individual believers now. And so what we see here is that the warning is that they must give heed to revelation given by the Son, because he is superior to angels. Disobedience will not result in a loss of spiritual salvation. Disobedience will mean the loss of physical life. Now, in the second part of verse 3 and verse 4, we see the superiority of the gospel to the Mosaic law. And we see it in three ways. The second part of verse 3, which having at the first, this is the gospel, which having at the first been spoken through the Lord, was confirmed unto us by them that heard. Now, so in its original announcement, it was spoken through the Lord. And this was initially declared by the Son himself, not an angel, but the Son. And second, it had a continuous, convincing proclamation in that it was authenticated by those who heard him speak the word, and they were the apostles. So, what Jesus taught has continued to be spread by those who heard him speak. And that's what the apostles did. And here we see, we notice here, the author excludes himself from that group. It was confirmed, it says it was confirmed unto us. That means the author as well, by them that heard. So the author, unlike the other apostles, was not an eyewitness to what Jesus said, because he's now getting this second hand from the apostles. And in verse 4, it says, God also bearing witness with them, which is with the apostles, both by signs and wonders and by manifold powers and by gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. So the third thing we see here is that it was further authenticated, the message was further authenticated as to its truthfulness through signs, wonders, power, and gifts. There were manifold divine authentications of the truth that these apostles were speaking. And God authenticated the message of the apostles through these four ways. First up, signs. What are signs? Well, signs they refer to miracles that reveal and have a divine purpose, and they bear witness of a person's claims. So the miracle has a divine purpose. Wonders emphasizes the fact that they attract attention and cause amazement, whatever is being done. Manifold powers shows that these miracles came through the source of divine power, and gifts their divine enablements. Now, a common misconception here is that in the book of Acts, all believers were doing all kinds of miracles, signs, and wonders, but that's not actually the case. When we went through the book of Acts, we saw that it was only done by the apostles or the apostolic legates, those who were appointed to do so by the apostles, by the laying on of the apostles' hands. So it was not everybody doing these things. It was the apostles. And the purpose of it was to authenticate their message, the message that they were preaching about Jesus. Now, even so, in this passage here, he clearly states here that these signs, wonders, and so on were done by the eyewitnesses, not by the next generation of believers. And these spiritual gifts were according to his own will. Why? Well, because it's God who decides who gets which gift. And you can check that out in 1 Corinthians 12, verses 7 to 11. That's 1 Corinthians 12, 7 to 11. Now, these gifts are distributed sovereignly as God wills. He's the one who decides who gets what gift. We don't ask him for any special gift. Now, what's the warning here? The warning here is in light of the uniqueness of the one who gave this revelation, and in light of the uniqueness of how it was tested and authenticated, and how it came to those who were the readers of this epistle, the Hebrew believers, the author warns them. He says, listen, be careful not to neglect this revelation to the point of becoming indifferent or apathetic towards it. If God did not tolerate indifference to his revelation that came through angels, the Mosaic law, he certainly will not tolerate it to his revelation that came by means of his unique Son. So the warning is, be careful, do not drift away from what the revelation that came through the Son. You have salvation, you possess it now, live in it, act out your life in faith in it. Now we're going to see that the author is now going to prove Jesus's humanity. And we're going to see it proof here from his sovereignty. And we're going to see this in verses 5 to 9. Now, verse 5. For not unto angels did he subject the world to come, whereof we speak. So the writer's first argument, which we saw back in chapter 1, verses 1 to 14, he showed the superiority of the Son to angels in his deity. Okay? Here, we're going to look at the other side of the coin to show that even in his humanity, Jesus, in some way, he is superior to angels. Now, back in chapter 1, verse 14, he showed there that angels are servants. That means that they cannot be rulers. You cannot be a ruler if you're a servant. Now, in chapter 2, verse 5, the writer points out that to no angel did God give authority of the world to come. And the Greek word for world here is the inhabited world. To no angel did God give the inhabited world. And in this case, it is the world to come. It says the world to come, which means it's the millennium or the messianic age. Now, where it says the world to come, the author uses here, which a very common rabbinic term for the messianic kingdom. What he's saying here is that the messianic kingdom will not be ruled by an angel. God did not give the authority of the earth over to any angel, either in the present or in the future. And in verses 6 to 8, we see that the writer he quotes from Psalm chapter 8, verses 5 to 7. But one had somewhere, this is chapter 8, 5 to 7. But one had somewhere testified, saying, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you visit him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor, and did set him over the work of your hands. Verse 8. You did put all things in subjection under his feet, for in that he subjected all things unto him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. But now we see not yet all things subject to him. Okay, so that's verse 8. So in verses 6 to 8, he quotes Psalm 8, verses 5 to 7. And what he does there, he shows that although man was created lower than the angels, God gave the authority over this earth to Adam. All right? Now, Adam lost his dominion and right to rule when he sinned. And Satan then usurped the authority over this earth. And presently, this earth is being ruled by fallen angels, Satan, the prince of this world, and his demons. They rule this earth not because God gave it to them, but because they usurped the authority from man when he fell, when he sinned. So they usurped that authority. If you go back into Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, we see God's purposes for man. Back in Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens, over the cattle and over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves upon the earth." So God's original purpose for man was that he be created a little lower than the angels as far as his being is concerned, yet be crowned with glory and honor. And in verse 8, God crowned man the king of nature, and he gave him authority over the physical world. So God gave sovereignty of this world over to man, because it says he put all things into subjection to him. Nowhere in that Genesis account do we see God giving any authority, any dominion over this world to angels. Now, while God gave the authority over this earth to man, man has never had the opportunity to practice it because of his fall. The dominion given to man is not yet fulfilled, but it will be fulfilled in the millennium through the ideal man, Messiah, Jesus Christ. And the fact is, but now we see not yet all things subjected to him. It has not yet happened that man is ruling sovereignly over the physical earth. He lost it when he fell, and because of his sin, he does not have the power to regain it. He has not the power to regain it from the one who usurped it, which is Satan and his fallen angels. In verse 9, we behold him who has been made a little lower than the angels, even Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that by the grace of God he should taste of death for every man. So in verse 9, it was Jesus who regained dominion for man, and he will exercise man's rule over the earth in the Messianic kingdom, or the millennial kingdom. So God's original goal for Adam is now going to be fulfilled by the last Adam, Jesus Christ. And the author of the book of Hebrews, this is the first time he uses the name Jesus. And what he's doing here is he's emphasizing his human name, because he's now emphasizing the humanity of Jesus. By means of his humiliation, he became a man. Now, what's the purpose of his humiliation? It's to taste death for every man. Remember, he is tasting death for every man. So atonement was unlimited. And here again, this is the first mention of his death in this book. Now, the writer here teaches 5 lessons in this verse. Lesson 1 is the recipient of his humiliation is humanity, man. The extent of his humiliation is that he became lower than the angels. For while in his deity, Jesus was superior to the angels, in his humanity, he who was the Lord of the angels now became lower than the angels. And the third thing we see is that the purpose of his humiliation was to taste of death for every man. Now, it's not like tasting an ice cream. You have a lick of it. That's not what it means, to taste of death. It means, it doesn't mean to nibble it or to lick or you know, to have a little taste. It means to appropriate. Jesus appropriated death. He experienced it for every man. So atonement, it's unlimited. And this is the first mention here of his death. The fourth thing we learn here is that the motive of his humiliation was the grace of God. And the fifth thing is the result of his humiliation is that he eventually was crowned with glory and honor in his exaltation when he returned to heaven at the ascension. Now, because he was resurrected from the dead, in the future, all things will be put in subjection under his feet. Now, we're talking about Jesus, the man, the one who came in incarnate and who died, resurrected, ascended. So the future fulfillment of verse 8 is now guaranteed because of his resurrection. And Messiah will rule as a man over the kingdom, and he will put all things into subjection to himself. Now, the summary of verses 5 to 9. Sovereignty over this planet was promised to man, not to angels. We see that in Genesis 1, 26 to 27. Secondly, man's sovereignty and right to rule was lost because of the fall. Although man still has the title deed, he no longer has the authority to exercise it. Third thing we see is that the Messiah, as the ideal representative man, has won back this sovereignty for man because he defeated Satan at the cross. And a fourth thing, he will eventually exercise this sovereignty in the Messianic kingdom. Now, this was never promised to angels. And as far as sovereignty is concerned, in his present humanity, by virtue of his sovereignty on earth, he is then superior to angels. So in his present humanity, by virtue of his sovereignty on earth, he is superior to angels. So we see that he was superior to angels, in his deity, but now we see that he is superior to angels in his humanity. So Jesus won back for man the sovereignty to rule on this earth by dying. Now, there are 5 ramifications for Messiah's death, or his death for dying for man. First of all, he underwent the sufferings of death that emphasizes the physical agony. Secondly, he was crowned with glory and honor because of what he had accomplished on the cross and at the ascension. And in this way, he now manifested the grace of God by becoming a man to die for every man. And then we see that he experienced death, which means he tasted death, means he experienced death for every man. And we see it was a substitutionary death. It was for every man. All right. So this other little section here, we're going to see the proof from his salvation. And again, we're talking about the proof of his superiority to the angels. Now, the author is going to deal here with the purpose of the Messiah's death in these verses 10 to 18 of chapter 2. He had to die in order to bring many sons to glory. And in providing salvation for fallen man, God chose to bypass angels. And we're going to see also that the death of Jesus was actually in harmony with the grace of God. Okay. Now, he became a savior through the death on the cross. He became Jesus the man, so that as a man, he was now able to die. And he had to die in order to provide salvation. So the point we see here is that the Son had to become human in order to experience death for man. God as God cannot die, but God who has become incarnate and taken on the form of a man can die as that man. And so what we see here is that the argument here is that the Redeemer is superior to the ones being redeemed. However, in a sense, the redeemed are now superior to those for whom no redemption was provided. Because you got to remember here, no redemption was provided for fallen angels. And in that sense, the redeemed, fallen man who's now been redeemed by the death of Christ, we're now superior to fallen angels. And because fallen angels are the only ones who need redemption, but there is no redemption for them. And that's why, according to 1 Corinthians 6, chapter 6, verse 3, it says, "Know ye not that we shall judge angels?" There's going to be a day coming at the great white throne judgment when believers will judge fallen angels. And so in the kind of salvation Jesus provided, human and not angelic, he is superior to angels, because he didn't provide any redemption for angels. It was only for human beings. And the writer now proceeds to give us 4 reasons for the incarnation and the cross. Remember, this is all about proving to these Hebrew believers that Jesus, the Messiah, is superior to angels. Because remember, angels are one of their pillars of Judaism. And we see the 4 reasons for the incarnation and the cross: to bring many sons to glory, to overcome the prince of death, to free the believer, and to help man. Now, in chapter 2, verse 10 to 13, this is to bring many sons to glory. "For it became him for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the author of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he that sanctifieth and they that are sanctified are all of one. For which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I sing thy praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I am the children whom God hath given me." So the first reason for Jesus' death on the cross was to bring believers into a state of glory. And in verse 10, his point is that the Father intended to perfect Jesus by means of suffering. Now, when he states here that Jesus is the author of our salvation, he uses a compound Greek term, which means that it means both to rule and to lead. He's our ruler, he's our leader, and he's our pioneer. So the author of the book of Hebrews points out that Jesus is our salvation author, and he's the pioneer of our redemption. And he presents three features concerning him as the pioneer of our redemption. First up, it says he was made perfect through sufferings. Now, that was the Father's intention. Now, just the word perfect here, it means to reach a goal or to attain a goal. So he attained a goal through sufferings. His sufferings attained a desired end, a desired goal. It doesn't mean that he was imperfect. Perfect means to attain an end, to attain a goal. And the means of completing his humanity was by means of his sufferings. His humanity was perfected, completed through sufferings. Second, just the first, made perfect through suffering. Second, he will bring many sons unto glory. Third, this was according to God's purpose, for it became him for whom are all things and through whom are all things. So what we see there is that it was God's plan and program for him to be a man and to suffer these things. Why? Because he is our salvation author and leader. If all believers will be glorified, which we see in Romans chapter 8, verses 28 to 30, Romans 8, 28 to 30, all believers will be glorified. Why would the author say here, many sons? and not all sons. See, he says many sons unto glory. Remember, the author is writing to Jews, right? So in a sense, all Jews are sons of God. We see that back from Exodus chapter 4, verse 22 to 23. Israel is my son, my firstborn, and I have said unto thee, let my son go. So what we see here, the reason he's using many sons is because only those in Israel, only those Jews, in this sense, who actually believe in him as the Messiah will be glorified. They're the many sons unto glory. Now in verse 11, we see that Jesus is also our sanctifier. Now because the sanctifier and the sanctified are one, he can call them brethren. By calling them brethren, again, Jesus is identifying with humanity. The sanctifier is the Messiah, and we'll see that later on in chapter 10, verse 10, and chapter 13, verse 12. And we're going to see in chapter 10, verse 14, that the sanctified are the believers, which are the Jewish believers that he's writing to here, which are you and I today. So believers are sanctified by this one, the sanctifier, and because the ones sanctified are sanctified by the sanctifier, they will become one with him. So God made them both one in their humanity, and they're both the sanctifier, which is Jesus Christ, and the sanctified, those who believe in him, who are redeemed by the blood, can call God Father. And it is this very process of sanctification that's going to lead to our final glorification. Remember, justification means to believe in the Messiah. We're justified before God. We're then sanctified as we go through life, and then future glorification. So we're going to be glorified because of the sanctifier who has sanctified us. A lot of sanctifiers here. In verses 12 to 13, the author quotes here 3 Old Testament passages to show the Messiah's identification with man. And at the same time, he's going to emphasize the humanity of Jesus. Remember in this section, last section, we showed this, the deity of Jesus. Now we're looking, the author is proving the humanity of Jesus. In verse 12, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I sing thy praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children whom God hath given me. Now, first up, he quotes here from Psalm 22, verse 22, which emphasizes, remember we spoke about the fact that he uses a lot of Old Testament quotations here because the Jews put a high esteem on Old Testament scriptures. He emphasizes in Psalm 22:22, he emphasizes the relationship of the Messiah to Israel following his resurrection. Jesus can call them brothers. Second quotation is from Isaiah 8, verse 17, pointing out that Isaiah the prophet, he put his trust in God to deliver Israel. And here the writer quotes that passage, showing the relationship of the Messiah to the Father, as Messiah now puts his trust in God and waits for his enemies to be subdued. And the third quotation we find in Isaiah 8, verse 18, where Isaiah points out that he and his 2 sons are signs to Israel. And the application here, it concerns the future relationship of the Son when he comes to claim his own, the remnant. Now, the point is the same. This one, Jesus, is our sanctifier. In that context, Isaiah the prophet was making a distinction between the remnant and the non-remnant, and the author of the book of Hebrews was also addressing, he was talking to the remnant of that day. Remember, the remnant of the day are those who have placed their faith in Jesus as the Messiah. Now, the second thing we see here is that he overcomes his death, the incarnation, and death overcomes the prince of death. In verse 14, chapter 2, verse 14, since then the children are sharers in flesh and blood, he also in like manner partook of the same, that through death he might bring to naught him that had the power of death, that is the devil. Now, author starts out here by showing what the object of the incarnation was. Since then, the children are sharers in flesh and blood. And the Greek word sharers is the word koinonia, which means to have in common with. And in this case, what Jesus had in common with humanity was flesh and blood. Remember, God is spirit. He does not have flesh and blood, but he became man to have a common element with humanity, which is flesh and blood. Now, at the incarnation, he took hold of human nature as manifested by flesh and blood, but not sin. He was without sin. This, remember, this is not in place of his deity. It was something additional to it. He still had his deity, but in addition to his deity, he took on human nature. Have a look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. Philippians 2, 5 to 11, the kenosis. We studied that last night. Now, the Greek word for partook means to be in the middle of something. It means taking hold of something that is not natural to one's nature. It is not natural to God's nature to have flesh and blood, but he added to his divine nature flesh and blood. And having taken on flesh and blood, he could die. And by means of his death, he could render Satan's power inoperative. Now, where we have here to bring to naught, if you've got a King James version, you will read it says destroy, but the Greek word is kataieo, and it does not mean to destroy, but it means to render inoperative. And it's the same word that's used concerning the Mosaic law. Mosaic law was not destroyed, but it was rendered inoperative. And as a result, it does not hold any legal authority over the believer anymore. Satan is still around. He was not destroyed, still has his power. But insofar as the death of a believer is concerned, he has been rendered inoperative. He cannot put a believer to death. Now, throughout Old Testament history, Satan did have authority over the physical death of both believers and unbelievers. Today, he still has that authority over unbelievers, but he no longer has the authority of physical death of believers. His power in that realm has been rendered inoperative. There is one exception to this, and you can find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 to 5, and that was in the case of a young man who was excommunicated from the church because of a sin he failed to repent of, a moral sin. Now, when a believer is excommunicated, which means that he undergoes all the processes of church discipline, when he's excommunicated, it means that he's now put back under Satan's authority as far as his physical life is concerned. Satan could put a believer to death if he was excommunicated. Now, that same passage in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 1 to 5 goes on to say that his spirit is still saved, but his physical life is killed by Satan. This is the only exception where Satan has any authority over the death of a believer. Now, until Jesus died, Satan's weapon was physical death, but Jesus took that away from him, rendering that weapon inoperative for believers. Messiah's counter weapon is eternal life, and he attained this by means of his death. So his death brought eternal life. His death also took away the power of death from Satan. Now, Satan is still in existence, but believers are now freed of any necessary obligation to obey him. We have a choice. We don't have to obey him. Jesus is not only our pioneer in salvation, he's not only our sanctifier, but he's also our Satan conqueror. So when Messiah is ruling with honor and glory, Satan is going to be bound for 1,000 years. So the point here is that the Son had to become human in order to vanquish Satan. The third reason for the incarnation And the cross was to free the believer in verse 15, and might deliver all them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. The fear of death enslaves man. But you and I as believers, we are freed both from the fear of death and from death itself, because for the believer, death is no longer a punishment, but it is a means by which we actually enter into heaven. For the unbeliever, death is punishment. But for the believer, it is not punishment, but it is a way of entering into heaven to eternal joy. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 55, 1 Corinthians 15, 55, and Philippians 1:21. Philippians 1:21. Now, the point here is that the Son had to become human in order to free the believer from death in the future and the fear of death even now. Now, the fourth and last reason for the incarnation and the cross was to help man. We find this in chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. For verily not to angels doth he give help, but he giveth help to the seed of Abraham. Wherefore it behooved him in all things to be made like unto his brethren, that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. So in verse 16, we see that the sphere of Messiah's work was men, not angels. There were angels who fell, but God did not choose to provide salvation for fallen angels. He only chose to provide salvation for fallen man. And that is why the writer states, not to angels does he give help. To provide salvation, God had to become like the ones he's providing salvation for. And that is why God became man, to provide salvation for man. That is why the Messiah never took on angelanity, if there's such a word. He never became an angel because God never intended to provide salvation for fallen angels. He did become man to provide salvation for man. He became human, and not just any human, but of the seed of Abraham, which means that he came as a Jewish man. And the scope of his work we see in verse 17 is redemption. He was made like unto his brethren. He was made a Jewish man for three purposes: to become merciful, which is an attribute of humanity. Second, he was to become faithful in the administration of his priestly functions. And third, he was to become a high priest. Because as the author is going to tell us in chapter 5, verse 1, only a man could be a priest. And by becoming a priest, he made propitiation. Now, the word propitiation means to satisfy the wrath of God. By means of Jesus' death, God was propitiated. God's righteous demands were satisfied by the substitutionary payment of the blood of the Son for the sins of the people. The wrath of God against sin was now satisfied because it was all poured out upon Jesus on the cross. Now, the background of verses 14 to 17 is the Old Testament concept of the kinsman redeemer. Now, under the law of Moses, there were many ways that a Jew could get himself into trouble. And one of these was to fall into a state of indebtedness beyond his ability to repay naturally or normally. If a Jew under the Mosaic law found himself in that kind of situation, there's only one option left for him, and that was he had to sell himself into slavery and work as a slave for 6 years, and then he'd be released in the 7th year. Now, once he had sold himself into slavery, there were two options available to him. One alternative was to serve his 6 years and then be set free in the 7th. But a second possibility was the option of the kinsman redeemer. if a kinsman would pay off his indebtedness, he could be released from slavery before his 6 years were up. Now, we need to look at this here. To qualify, the kinsman redeemer had to meet 3 requirements. First, he had to be a kinsman or a blood relative. A stranger couldn't do it. Second, he had to have the price of redemption. He had to have the means to pay off his relative's debts. And third, the kinsman had to be willing to pay the price. It was not a mandatory role. Now, the Bible teaches that those who sin are slaves to sin. And this is true of all humanity. All are sinners. Yet, the Jews are also enslaved to the curse of the law due to their inability to keep the Mosaic law. Jesus, the kinsman redeemer, fulfilled all 3 requirements. First, he was a kinsman. By becoming human, he had a blood relationship to all humanity in general. Now, since he came as a member of the seed of Abraham, he had a blood relationship with Jewish humanity in particular. Second, he had the price of redemption. And in this case, the price of redemption was innocent human blood, because he was the only Jew who ever lived who kept the Mosaic law perfectly. He had innocent blood. Third, he had to be willing to pay the price. Now, Jesus himself said in John chapter 10, verse 18, "No man take my life from me, I lay it down of myself." Point: the Redeemer is superior to the redeemed. The redeemed are superior to those for whom no redemption was provided, and we shall judge angels. And that's 1 Corinthians 6, verse 3. Now, finally, we see in verse 18, the author now makes the application of Jesus' work to individual men in the conflict of life. And this verse shows what was involved in becoming like his brethren. It meant suffering and temptations. And there are 2 reasons why he can help. Because he was tempted and he also suffered. So he can help. In verse 18, "For in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted." So because he was tempted and because he suffered, he is now able to help all those who are tempted. And the word translated here as succor, it's a compound Greek word that means to run to the cry of. So when believers are in need and cry out for help, he runs to help. He runs to assist them in their temptation, in their sufferings. So Jesus is not only the author of salvation, he's not only Jesus the sanctifier, he's not only the Satan conqueror, but he's also Jesus the sympathizer. He's able to sympathize with those who are now being tempted. And that is your lot for today. Study hard, grow strong.